Hi, everyone. Good evening from the Bay Area. My name is Bernie Lim, and I am so excited. I am so hyped to welcome you all to this beautiful evening as we unveil the Institute for Healing and Justice in Medicine and our report towards the abolition of biological race in medicine, transforming clinical education, research, and practice. And at the Institute, we like to refer to our meetups not simply as meetings or webinars. We know that y'all have had a lot of those, but rather as a gathering and a coming together of hearts and minds. And so we saw on our RSVP list that there are so many people here tuning in from all places around the world. And it's just so beautiful to see a gathering that bridges folks from all different types of disciplines and perspectives, from our beloved communities to the social sciences and humanities, to public health, to medicine, to nursing, government, students, community activists. We see y'all. And I think my mom might have figured out Facebook, so hey mom. And thank you all for making time to learn together about these important topics, to be here with each other, and to support this work for our communities. This is truly what health looks like as we place love, healing, and justice at the center of health, and as we deconstruct the power hierarchies that are embedded in Western medicine. And so as part of the Institute for Healing and Justice in Medicine, of the utmost importance to us and our Institute is knowing that the justice and the peace and the love that we seek in our world actually begins with ourselves. It begins with seeing ourselves as worthy of that same justice, peace, and love. And our bodies and our breath are our first sites of liberation. And so before we begin this gathering together, I invite you to join me and all here in this gathering, all across the world, all across time zones, if you're able to, and in whatever capacity feels right, to join us in 3 collective breaths as a grounding ritual for today's gathering of hearts and minds. And I invite you to honor and perhaps visualize how these breaths done together in real time with attendees from around the world can carve more pathways for necessary healing in this widespread suffering that happens today. And so I invite you, if it feels comfortable, perhaps lowering your gaze, perhaps just pausing, or perhaps having your hand over heart and belly, or closing your eyes. And we'll take 3 collective breaths as a way to acknowledge that justice starts with our breath and starts with us. And so wherever you are in your breath cycle, I invite you to exhale all your air out, completely releasing and leaving any stress or anxiety here in this space that we've created today. And inhaling together. And exhale, letting it go. And inhaling once more, a deep, full breath, acknowledging that justice starts with every cell of our body. And exhale, letting it go. And we'll take a 3rd collective breath, uplifting the intentions of this gathering and the efforts of all those gathered here who fight to speak truth to power in this world in their own ways. And we'll let it go with an exhale. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes, you can wiggle your fingers, you can do a little dance. And again, thank you so much for being here, whether in your PJs, whether in your work shirt. We're just so grateful that you've been able to make the time this evening. And again, we appreciate you for being here. And just a reminder that the full report has been out, and we invite you to share it, and we'll be overviewing it this evening. And again, it's live on our website, instituteforhealingandjustice.org. In addition, we're working on the PDF version and we'll be emailing it once it is finished.
Hey everyone, my name is Maddie, and I just wanted to kick off this meeting with what we call a land acknowledgement, for those of you who aren't familiar. So we just wanted to recognize that our institutions that we belong to, UC Berkeley and UCSF, among a few others, sit on the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone. And we know that this land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. So we recognize that no matter where we are physically located in the United States, we have and continue to benefit from the use and occupation of these lands. So we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible our relationship and our institution's relationship with Native people. So to that extent, we want to just affirm Indigenous sovereignty and work to hold our institutions more accountable to the needs of Native and Indigenous peoples.
Hi, everybody. I'm Noor. Welcome. So in addition to talking about our report, I'm so excited for the interdisciplinary dialogue that involves students, scholars, and activists that we have planned today. And so part of our goal in bringing all these people together is to acknowledge that critical race theorists have actually been talking about some of the stuff we're about to talk about for a really long time. And while medicine has ignored their calls, we find it our responsibility to continue their work as we go into medicine ourselves. And so we're going to start with our presentation of the report and then move into the community dialogue, which features first a group that has done some amazing activism over at the San Francisco General Hospital, actually removing the use of race in the EGFR system there. And Dr. Monica Hahn, Dr. Vanessa Grubbs, Dr. Stephen Richmond, and Dr. Juliana Morris are going to be presenting about that work. And that's going to be followed by an interdisciplinary panel with Osagi Obasogi, Edwin Lindo, Angela Zhang, and Dr. Jennifer Tsai. And then we'll have a Q&A. So we have someone monitoring the Facebook comments right now. So if you have any questions, we'll definitely try to address some of them, as well as if you can't post on Facebook, you can email our email address, which is info@instituteforhealingandjustice.org. And then finally, we'll end the evening by talking about the Institute and the activities we have envisioned for that.
And again, we are Noor, Bernie, and Maddie, and we are all students of medicine and public health at the joint medical program with UC Berkeley School of Public Health and UCSF School of Medicine. Shout out JMP, we know that y'all are supporting, we appreciate it. And yes, I know you're probably thinking like, wait, what? Y'all are medical and graduate students who wrote a full 70+ page report and y'all just came from class today? And yes, it is true, we just came from class and we are here and we are so excited to be here. Uniquely in our program, we are learners of both medicine and critical race theory during our preclinical years. And we regularly engage in discussions about critical race theory as we study racial health disparities. And we are able to see both at once in a unique way that many fellow learners can't see. And the truth is that all three of us also came into medicine with diverse life experiences in community organizing, healing justice, and critical studies scholarship. We also care for underserved patients of color and at community clinics and safety net hospitals throughout the Bay Area. And these opportunities have allowed us to apply our theory into practice and have made us realize that there is a deeply needed change in the ways we approach health and well-being that will only come about by enabling and uplifting interdisciplinary knowledge and centering the lived experiences of our patients. And so again, this is just to emphasize that all of these diverse perspectives of ours, not just medical science, enables us to uniquely see how we can evolve into being the best doctors for our beloved patients and communities.
So we also just have to, before we really launch into this thing, we have to shout out all our supporters and all the people who made this happen. First, it's incredibly important that there is one person who's not speaking on this today who we wouldn't have been able to do this paper. Brenly Rowland is the other co-author on this paper, and I know she's watching, so Brenly, you're amazing, thank you. We also had an awesome team of peer editors, many of whom are also watching, so thank you. And an incredible team of interdisciplinary faculty, editors, advisors, and panelists. some of whom you'll be hearing from today, and then a bunch of interdisciplinary co-sponsors as well. In particular, want to shout out the UC Berkeley School of Public Health and Bria Watts, who helped us make this Facebook Live thing happen. None of us know how to do this otherwise. And also the Othering and Belonging Institute, who is helping us create the PDF form of this report and is also hosting a report on their website as well. So just a huge thank you to everyone who made this possible.
And again, we want to just acknowledge why we came to this space and our positionality. And so first, we just want to affirm that we refuse to be part of a system that perpetuates harmful, deadly practices against Black people and people of color.
We also think it's important to acknowledge that, again, we are not the first to be making this call. We aim to amplify the existing voices in scholarship and help bridge the gap between critical race theory and medicine.
And thirdly, we want to talk about not only what we are against, but also what we are for. And so we envision a world where the social construct of race is not conflated with biology, and the health consequences of racism are acknowledged, addressed, and cared for in all its forms.
And as medical and graduate students, literally for this report, again, it's basically a master's thesis, we had to deconstruct and reconstruct our own medical education alongside our studies to truly unearth what is the truth of how medicine continues to perpetuate injustices. We hope that this report guides communities, learners, clinicians, organizations on how to approach these topics. And so first we start with a social and structural analysis overview that emphasizes racism, not race, causes health disparities. Then we dig into a historical overview of how medicine and health sciences have biologized race. And then we talk about how to apply these frameworks into how race-based medicine comes up in medical diagnosis and treatment. And again, this gathering is only a preview of the report, so whatever is bolded on this slide is what we're focusing on today, and the rest can be found on our website.
Okay, so when we are starting to talk about the first section of our report, I think it's important to say that what we're trying to do here is to build a space where we are all learning together in public. These conversations can be difficult, they can be triggering. Racism, frankly, and talking about it is contentious, it's triggering, it's super vulnerable. So we want to just take a minute and think about what this means to you, what this brings up for you. And we want to be creating a space, even though it's a digital space, that we're all connected through this Facebook Live across the nation, creating a space where we're coming from love and speaking truth. So push yourself to be open to learning, as we will be open to learning too. We also want to acknowledge that we are only talking about one part of racism in medicine today, and there's a lot more to address, but we think we have some unique tools and perspectives from our training as social scientists and medical students that we want to share today in order to open up a broader discussion about how we all want to be able to provide healthcare in the ways that align with our humanity. And again, we're speaking as medical students, but we also know that this applies probably much broader in all of healthcare and medicine. So the foundation for this first section of our paper is a quote that is attributed to Dorothy Roberts, who is a renowned critical race scholar and law professor who studies race-based medicine. She may or may not be following, so if you are, honestly, you might be a hero of ours. So basically, we probably, to break down all of this, we're going to need to define each of these sections. So first, let's start with the definition of race. What is race? So the definition of race is actually a social category constructed by socioeconomic and political forces that determine its content and importance. This is not to take away from self-identity or agency or autonomy, but simply to highlight that when we talk about race, we are talking about a category that is defined in social terms, not biological ones. So what is race not? Race is not biology. Biomedical researchers and social scientists have established that the concept of race cannot adequately or accurately describe global human genetic diversity. It's also not ancestry, which is defined based on your genealogical history. It's also not ethnicity or ethnic group. It's a much more slippery concept. Ethnicity is a more slippery concept that's often conflated with race, but the best definitions tend to make it a self-defined one related to your identity with culture and other affiliations as a proxy for ancestry. Also, confusingly, the US Census uses both pretty indiscriminately. But let's just stick to the fact for today that race is a concept defined by society's perception of you and your perception of society based on some arbitrary markers of difference, not any inherent biology inside your cells. A lot of this work is based on some critical scholars who might also be listening. So if they are, shout out to Clarence Gravely and Michael Udell. You guys are amazing. Next, we're going to talk about what racism actually is. So the definition of racism is a system of power that upholds the political and social capital of white supremacy in the United States. And it is deeply embedded in the social, political, and economic structures. Again, racism is a heavy topic, but we think it's really important for us all to be on the same page here about what we're talking about. So if you need to, take a minute and see what comes up for you. Recognize whatever emotions and reactions you may have as information for yourself. We believe that we can't change the system and we can't heal others or ourselves without making space for these emotions and working through them. So take a minute to work through those just hold them for yourself, and we will move through the rest of the presentation with us present. Okay, this graphic helps us understand that racism has a lot of layers and a lot of different levels. We don't have time to talk about all of these today. They're all in our report if you want to see them. But basically the national narrative and the way that like the media, for example, tends to have us talking about racism would make us think that it is just one person being violent to another person or being mean to another person on the basis of their skin tone. But interpersonal racism, for starters, is much more complicated than that. And secondly, it's just one piece of this puzzle. We want to acknowledge that there's been a lot of hard-fought progress over the years, and there's so much further to go. So our point here today with this graphic is simply to highlight that we need to move way beyond interpersonal racism, need to broaden the conversation, especially in medicine and health, to include institutional and structural racism alongside the other types in order to be able to create a truly anti-racist, just, and healing medical system. So I apologize, I get to throw two more complicated diagrams at y'all to talk about racism and structural racism in particular, but this one helps us understand the sort of third part of that sentence, racism, not race, causes health disparities. This sort of helps us walk through why. So let's walk through this with an example that I was taught in my undergrad class. I was in an undergrad class in community health, and I was taught that in the late 90s and early 2000s, the community of West Oakland, which is a predominantly Black neighborhood here in the East Bay, started trying to get people to understand and better address the fact that they had really high asthma rates. They were about 5 times higher than any of the surrounding neighborhoods. And ultimately, with the help of some awesome scientists and public policy folks, it was shown that the pollution in the neighborhood was also approximately 5 times higher, and that it was coming directly from the busy Oakland port and the highways full of trucks that were ringing the neighborhood around it. So the disparities in asthma would be down on the bottom right there, the disparities in distribution of disease, and the environmental determinants of health that we're talking about, the Oakland port and the highways, would be the sort of social determinants of health. And that's where my class stopped in undergrad. But the thing that we need to be asking is, who made the decision about where the highways go? Who made the decision about why certain people are living in the neighborhoods that are most polluted? And that was the part that we start moving up the chain here. We start thinking about, okay, why are there power and wealth imbalances? Who is making these decisions? And it's becoming more commonplace in medicine, at least, to start to name things like our country's long history of redlining and other discriminatory practices like highway construction and systematic disinvestment in communities of color. That's good. But we need to make it one step further. We rarely make it all the way up to naming the root cause way up at the top, which is structural racism. So if we start from the top then, structural racism decides who gets to make decisions and why, which is our power and wealth imbalances, which then determine our social determinants of health, which lead to different psychosocial stresses, unhealthy behaviors, and disparities in distribution of disease and well-being. We should also note that we know that folks who are holding multiple intersectional identities are even further marginalized along these axes of power. So First, this is the last complicated diagram for the day, I promise. Second, this is where we come in. This is our interpretation of this diagram. I should mention the last diagram is adapted from a phenomenal physician named Dr. Joya Freire-Perry. So we adapted this and trying to understand how we as trainees see racism in medicine structuring our clinical education, our research, and our practice. This obviously has a lot of different consequences, but the one that we're focusing on today is that the false concept of biological race, remember we said earlier that race is not biology, it's actually just the social concept. Race as biology has gotten entrenched in our medical education, and this both directly causes disparities, as we'll talk about a little bit more in depth later in this, but it also creates all kinds of additional stressors and lets people skip straight over social determinants of health. It encourages providers to not address how racism creates health disparities and instead just point to individuals and superficial aspects like skin color and healthy behaviors. Honestly, even the practitioners and researchers that we know are trying to pursue justice and equity sometimes ascribe observed health disparities to this idea that race has some kind of biological component. And that's because if it's how you're taught and you hear it enough times from people in power, you just start to repeat it. So the rest of the presentation is going to go on to explain how the false concept of biological race plays out in depth, but honestly, I just wanted to share that I'm speaking to you today because I'm being taught via algorithms and textbooks and even other providers to expect certain things about the bodies and lives of people based on how they look in the name of medicine. And I just want to ask, why is that how I'm being taught medicine? Why is that how I'm being taught to heal patients? Eventually, all of this adds up. All of these different instances of racism that are structuring our clinical education, research, and practice. Because conflating race and biology asserts a false naturalized racial hierarchy and perpetuates flawed science. It leads to patients who are diagnosed later with worse outcomes and given care that doesn't acknowledge their lived experience. It also hides the true problem, that we're not naming racism as a root cause of inequities in our society and as a root cause of the issues in medicine. So this blindness and confusion is our call to action. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic back to Bernie.
Thank you, Maddie. In this next section, we'll be talking about how racism has been historically codified in science and medicine. And this section is particularly important because one of the biggest pushbacks against our report findings is that many scientists and doctors are telling us, but science is objective. It crosses no political lines. Bodies are bodies and facts are facts. As medical and graduate students who apply critical race theory into our patient care and community organizing, we firmly disagree. We assert that science and medicine have no claims to objectivity, and we thank the decades of work by scholars in the history of science and medicine and critical studies for teaching us this. We also assert that claims of objectivity in science and medicine are insidious, they are dangerous, and they are harmful in patient care, and that the history we overview in this report must be taught to all learners and clinicians. And we're students, so we can't remark on the whole history of racism in science and medicine in this 2-hour gathering. But a good place to start is with the reality that the conceptualization of race as biology is rooted in colonization. While we can't remark on the whole history of racism in science and medicine, we can actually see that race began to emerge in society as a function of colonization, as European colonizers began encountering natives and importing slaves who looked different than themselves. Scientific racism emerged from theories of biological inferiority, including Carl Linnaeus's polygenism and Dr. Samuel Morton's efforts to compare cranial capacities of white colonizers, native people, and enslaved people, as seen on the left. These flawed theories cemented societal conceptions of skin tone differences and non-whiteness as biological concepts. This is also just simply bad science because colonizers sought to affirm that white people were superior to Black, brown, and native people through the use of quote-unquote scientific methods. And as this history continued unchallenged, the development of medical tools that we still use today, such as the spirometer in the middle, were founded to further codify concepts of biological inferiority of Black and brown people. And eventually, because a lot of this is unchallenged, the historical context laid the groundwork for further racial inequality, including the expropriation of property from natives, denial of political rights, slavery and other forms of coercive labor, and explicit extermination and lynching of non-white people, such as the picture on the right of Black men who are part of the Tuskegee syphilis study. And so for the rest of this unveiling of the report, we will focus on how racism is embedded in the history of spirometry, which is used for lung function assessment. We also want to name and uplift the work of Lindsey Braun at Brown, who has written books and amazing articles on this, whom we've cited in our report countless times. And so during the outbreak of tuberculosis in the 19th century, interest in the modern spirometer took hold as a means of assessing the fitness of police forces and military personnel and life insurance applicants in England. And again, this is just to emphasize that medicine and public health were not created as institutions of healing for our society, but for the purpose of population surveillance and fitness assessment. John Hutchinson, who is an English surgeon, was credited for inventing the spirometer in the 1840s and also coining the measurement vital capacity, which is taught to many learners and clinicians today. Then, the application of Hutchinson's spirometer quickly spread, including Samuel Cartwright, who used the spirometry on slavery plantations. Cartwright was a Southern physician and plantation owner who was the first person to use the spirometer as a tool for comparison of lung function between Black people and white people. And then Cartwright had a friend, or maybe they weren't friends, but they definitely liked each other, because Jay Gould published the first study in 1869 that would reinforce notions of biological inferiority of Black people with data on racial comparisons of lung function with large sample sizes and anthropometric measurements of Union soldiers. And Gould would then attempt to assert in multiple studies with help from the spirometry numbers that he found that slaves had poor nutrition status and higher rates of pneumonia, typhoid fever, and respiratory illnesses. But instead of contributing it to the conditions of slavery, Jay Gould concluded that African-American slaves had physical pathologies and thus needed to be kept under the institution of slavery. And of course, all of this happened, and we can't forget, without naming, the political leadership of Thomas Jefferson, as well as many of the founding fathers who were doctors, Thomas Jefferson, in his notes on the state of Virginia, asserted that there were marked distinctions between white colonizers and slaves, and that there was a difference in their lung function through the pulmonary apparatus. And so in conclusion, this brief history of the key figures involved in the history of the spirometer illustrates how notions of biological racial difference in lung capacity actually is related to the foundations of public health and slavery. In particular, the motivation for the creation of the spirometer by Hutchinson and its subsequent use by Cartwright and Gould was simply used to reinforce slavery. And so yes, we're gonna say it one more time. Slavery was justified through medical and public health institutions and methods. And for real, I know all of y'all who are students and learners and clinicians, how many of y'all actually knew about this history? Isn't it wild? And what's even more wild is that many physicians, students, and learners today use a spirometer daily and learn about the values associated with it every day, which now Noor will talk about.
Thank you, Bernie, for outlining that history. And for me, when I first learned about that violent history of spirometry that Bernie just outlined, and for many other learners like me, that is enough of an impetus for us to question how doctors can so often unquestioningly use spirometers without talking about their origins at all. But what is even more horrible is the ways in which medicine continues to uphold these racist notions of biological inferiority in lung function in current practice. So as one example, when I was writing the lung function section of our report, I decided to check out UpToDate. And so UpToDate is this evidence-based clinical resource that clinicians use every single day after patient appointments for information about things like medications, diseases, etc. I could consider it like a go-to Wikipedia page made specifically for medical practice. And I'll share with you a quote that I found about lung function. Just gonna read it out loud. Quote, healthy African Americans have spirometric values that are approximately 12% lower than Americans of Caucasian descent of the same age, sex, and height. This difference is in part due to a difference in the ratio of trunk size to standing height, i.e., African Americans have longer legs for a given height. Genetics and nutritional factors may also play a role in differences by race or ethnicity. So that meme summarizes my reaction when I first saw this quote, just a lot of confusion, and I'm gonna share with you a couple of the reasons. And so one is that we know that when studies use the category African Americans, race is typically either self-identified or guessed by the clinician. And to think that a statement as simplistic as, quote, African Americans have longer legs for a given height could possibly apply to all people who would fall into that category is absurd. Secondly, so as a reminder, a spirometer, as Bernie talked about, is a common office test that is used to assess how well your lungs work, and it does so by measuring how much air you inhale and exhale. And so if you're confused about how trunk size to standing height ratio can be emphasized as such an important and critical factor in determining lung function, so am I. And unsurprisingly, I could not find any literature that backs that up either. And I did try to look back at the citations for this quote and up to date. Actually, sorry, before I talk about citations, I also want to say that let's say trunk to standing height ratio really is such an important factor, then race is simply a poor proxy for it. So as I started to say, I did try looking back at the citations for this quote, and the trunk to standing height ratio quote in up to date cites two articles, but one of which led me to another article that cited another article that both just repeated the same statement without any explanation. And the second citation literally says, quote, differences due to ethnicity are not well defined, which then begs the question, if they are so poorly defined, how can a resource so frequently used as up to date so uncritically repeat that conclusion? And the answer to that question is actually why we juxtapose the history that Bernie outlined with the contemporary manifestations that I'm talking about right now, because that racist history that's been ingrained in medicine for so long is what tells us how lung function tests came to be categorized by race at all in the first place. And when we combine that history with the reminder that race is a bad proxy for other factors like genetics or nutritional factors or socioeconomic factors or pollution, understanding that history reminds us which clinical guidelines to question and why. And the next thing I want to talk about is how these assumptions that Up to Date reiterates come up in practice. So in practice, these assumptions about differences in lung function are built into spirometers as, quote, race correction factors that lead to different diagnoses for patients of different races or ethnicities. So as this image shows, during spirometry, a patient takes a deep breath and blows into a tube as hard as possible, and then a machine records the results of the spirometry test. And these machines typically have either buttons or drop-down menus for different races or ethnicities that the technician or physician just selects. And then based on guidelines from groups like the American Thoracic Society, these selections result in different coefficients automatically being applied to patients' lung function results, depending on the selected race. And as we explain in greater detail in the report, and want to continue to reiterate, these correction factors are based in flawed science and are based in racist assumptions about biological difference between races, even though race is a socially constructed category. And in addition, as Lundy Braun, if you're watching, hello, talks about based on her research, technicians and physicians are actually often unaware that they're activating a correction factor when they push down these buttons or select drop-down menus, despite the fact that the correction factors activated by their selections can have devastating consequences for patients. So I think this quote from Anne Fausto Sterling summarizes these devastating consequences well. I apologize, is the slide incorrect? Okay. So this quote from Anne Fausto Sterling: technicians present spirometry results corrected for race, so that for an African American to receive a diagnosis of impaired lung function, for example, a worker seeking disability compensation for lung damage from asbestos, he or she has to be dramatically sicker relative to a white American before receiving an equivalent disease diagnosis. And this quote is actually referring to a real life example in which, after citing medical, quote unquote, medical scientific evidence that Black people have different lung capacity than white people, lawyers for an insulation manufacturer named Owens Corning asked the judge to require Black people to show that they have worse scores on their lung test than white people as a result of asbestos exposure before they could qualify for a trial. However, the white workers had no difficulty having their cases heard with the same test results. And next, we just want to ground some of these things we talked about in a clinical example. And this clinical example is actually adapted from a true interaction that a medical student had with her preceptor.
Okay, so this may feel a bit like a case presentation for those of you who are physicians, clinicians, providers in the room. Danielle M. is a patient at her local hospital coming in for a checkup with her doctor regarding difficulty breathing over the past few days. As her doctor is preparing for her visit, she looks at the information stated in the electronic medical record. Gender, female. Age, 50. Reason for visit, difficulty breathing for the past month. Language, English. Race, ethnicity, Black, African American. Smoker, yes. So those of you who are familiar with differential diagnoses probably already have your gears turning in your head, but basically with those demographic clues from Danielle's electronic medical record, her doctor arrives at the reasoning for possible diagnoses to discuss with Danielle, probably chronic obstructive pulmonary lung disease, or COPD, and asthma, or asthma. The physician plans to perform a spirometer test. Again, that's this method of assessing lung function that we've been talking about by measuring the volume of air the patient is able to expel from their lungs after maximal inspiration.
And so for Danielle, the pulmonary lung function test results did not result in a clinical diagnosis. And this is because no diagnosis was made because the values produced were within normal limits when the racial correction factors were applied. Danielle's doctor tells her that they'll have to have a number of follow-up visits and additional lab testing in order to confirm her diagnosis. And so Danielle departs from the doctor's appointment disappointed and nervous that her breathing continues to be labored and difficult, and that it will take several more appointments to find out what is going on. And she is unable to make appointments in the coming month due to family obligations and her hectic work schedule.
Afterwards, a medical student asked Danielle's doctor if race correction factors could have impacted Danielle's spirometry results. And the doctor replies, quote, "Black people are always overdiagnosed and overmedicated. Thankfully, these correction factors help with that." So as a medical student hearing this, I'm just reminded of other experiences I've had as well, where people I look up to, people who seem to be practicing medicine because they care about healing people, repeat these statements that I know to be problematic, given everything we've talked about today. And even though I've literally studied and I'm presenting on how deeply embedded racism is in medicine, I find myself repeatedly disheartened or surprised or confused. And part of that is because, like in this case, biological race is actually framed to us as a solution to health disparities, and it becomes really difficult to entangle the insidious and hidden ways that biological race is manifested. And so for me, this quote from a medical student preceptor is a reminder to highlight that I and that we want to work to what we want to work toward is not colorblind medicine, but really anti-racist medicine. And that's part of why I'm here giving this presentation, writing this report, starting this institute, is because I want to contribute to a conversation about the medical practice that I actually want to be a part of. And so I also wanted, as we shared at the beginning, our report actually goes into various other diseases and diagnosis and treatment, and we won't be able to talk about them today. The next presentation with the folks at San Francisco General Hospital will talk a bit about kidney disease and GFR, and we definitely encourage you to read about everything else at instituteforhealingandjustice.org as well. And finally, we want to leave you with our conclusions.
First, medicine has willfully ignored its racist history, in spite of ongoing calls from scholars and activists to rectify its violent and oppressive history. This has resulted in medicine continuing to inflict and perpetuate racism that harms communities of color.
Two, using race as a heuristic for diagnosis of disease and interpretation of symptoms masks racism.
3, because of the biological use of race in clinical guidelines and education, patients of color are being systematically misdiagnosed and undertreated and are therefore at risk for bad health outcomes.
4, race-based medicine teaches people of color that their bodies and communities are abnormal, deficient, and broken, increasing stress and burden of racist stigma. Medicine is an unwelcoming and hostile space for people of color.
And 5, if we don't dismantle race-based medicine, it will be perpetuated, ultimately harming patients in real, concrete ways.
So the last part of our report is that we wanted to not only say what we are against, but also what we are for. So we wanted to present you all with our vision forward. So as physicians in training, we envision a world where the social construct of race is not conflated with biology, and where the health consequences of racism are acknowledged, addressed, and cared for in all their forms. To make this a reality, medicine must adopt anti-racist institutional practices regarding research, practice, and education.
Our first vision is that medicine must unveil and teach how racism in all its forms have shaped scientific advancements, tools, and diagnoses in clinical education, research, and practice.
Number 2, in order to account for the health consequences of racism, clinicians should prioritize social history intakes and be aware of how social and structural stressors perpetuate racism and racial health inequities.
This one is my favorite and one that I think we get to talk about a lot in the upcoming panel discussion, hopefully. We must adopt just anti-racist standards and guidelines for diagnosis and treatment of all patients. To me, this means not learning in a system that teaches me how to be a better racist, but in fact one that teaches me how to be an anti-racist. It means practicing anti-racist medicine, not colorblind medicine. And what we mean by that is that race should not be used as a biological determinant in clinical guidelines, nor the research informing them. Clinical guidelines on racial health outcomes must take into account the consequences of racism. Biological race does not exist and therefore cannot be the cause of disparities. Disparities are the result of multi-level racism. So in short, we need to address head-on how race is used in medicine.
This one is my favorite. So number 4, healthcare providers play a key role in combating racism. In order to support their patients in feeling happy, healthy, and strong, clinicians must seek to affirm the strengths their patients bring, not assume they are a collection of risk factors. Clinicians need a paradigm shift into approaching patients of color as whole rather than broken.
Great, that was actually my favorite too, but this one's pretty good as well. Number 5, medicine must break down its own intellectual silos and hierarchy to build interdisciplinary alliances with thought leaders who have built foundations on the intersections of racism and health. We call for dialogue and action and solidarity with those from affected communities, critical race theorists, community-based organizations, and racial justice initiatives.
So we're going to turn this over to our next presenters, but first we just wanted to leave you with this thought, and if you have questions for us, please feel free to leave them in the chat or email us. We just want to ask, what can we imagine for clinical education, research, and practice that is anti-racist, that is just, and that is healing?
And that concludes this part of our gathering of which we unveil our report. And we are so hyped. Wow, we are just so excited that y'all have heard this and that so many people are tuning in live. So again, thank you. And now we're going to transition over to talk about, I know a lot of y'all in the RSVPs are like, I know this is like super wrong, but how do I actually put this into practice? and what are the tools that I can bring to my institution, my organization, and my career as to how to really put forth justice. And let me just tell you that this next group of amazing activists and doctors and community organizers who practice this justice not only within the medicine and the clinics that they work at, but also in their lives outside of medicine, are going to tell you how to exactly do that. And so I am so grateful to introduce this next group: Dr. Monica Hahn, Dr. Vanessa Grubbs, Dr. Stephen Richmond, and Dr. Juliana Morris, on their work of removing the use of race in EGFR at a local SF hospital. Thank y'all for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Bernie, for that amazing introduction. I'm just going to say that we're going to start with Vanessa Grubbs is going to start us off, and then after that is going to be Juliana Morris, and then Stephen Richmond, and then I'll end it off.
Okay, great. Thanks, Monica. So I was asked to give some background about the kidney function test that we've been advocating for. And I'm a nephrologist. I've practiced at San Francisco General Hospital. And I remember when I started my nephrology training, my fellowship in 2009, like on the first day of orientation, the fellowship director explained to us about the equations for kidney function to estimate how well the kidneys are filtering our blood. And he explained then that there's a race correction if African American is roughly 20% higher than if not African American. So, and supposedly that was a proxy for muscle mass. And that was the first time that I was actually aware that that's what this was supposed to be. And so I asked at that time, so people tend to lose muscle mass as their kidney failure gets worse. So how does that really apply? And what about thin Black women, for example? Does that really apply to them? So it's this massive generalization. And the fellowship director said, good point. And when we just kind of rolled on. So lately with this group, I've been digging deeply into the origins of like, where does this come from? And the first equation that we have for measuring GFR, glomerular filtration rate, was published back in 1999. Now, when they were trying to develop the equation, they used a lot of biological variables that they thought could change how the kidneys handle creatinine, which is the blood test that we use to estimate kidney function. But they also put in self-reported race, white and Black. And they offered no rationale for why they thought race or Black kidneys might be different. But they put all of these variables into their statistical regression analysis, and Black race was significant. So when they published the paper, they said, well, it's probably because Black people have higher muscle mass. And they really based that on 3 studies in the distant past that really were not about muscle mass at all. So going forward, in 2009, we had a new equation that was published that was supposed to be even better. And what they did there is they continued to use race, but they took it a step further, actually. So this, the equation in this case was based on a tiny bit more diverse sample population. There were roughly 5% Asian and Hispanic in this group, but they set up the analysis to include race as Black versus other. So they set up the analysis to suggest that Black people are biologically different from every other human being on the planet. So that's what we've been using clinically, since 1999. We've been using these equations, and we had this updated variation on it in 2009. And we also have cystatin C. A lot of folks have been advocating for trying to include that because it's not so complicated, not so many things affect it. But again, unfortunately, in developing that equation, they tried to include race as a variable and offered no explanation for why race might affect the cystatin C, which is something that is in every cell with a nucleus. Thankfully, race did not show a signal, and so it was not included in the final equation. So there is an equation that does not have race in it. And I think with that, Monica, unless you think I left out anything, I'll pass the baton.
Thanks, Vanessa. My name is Juliana. I'm a family doctor at SF General. And at our hospital, previously, the way things were reported based on the equations Vanessa mentioned was we would see 2 lines in terms of kidney function for eGFR, estimated glomerular filtration rate, one if African American and one if not African American. And in our family medicine department, we knew that that was wrong. We knew that race-based medicine is painful and shameful, and the history that's there. And we had started doing some education within the department, really taking the lead from critical scholars, experts like Dr. Grubbs, who's very humble, and Black and Indigenous-led community organizations to encourage people to think more holistically, to look at the if non-African American value as a baseline, and then think about someone's nutritional status and muscle mass when drawing any type of clinical conclusions. And then 2 things happened. First, in late May, we learned through a listserv that colleagues at the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston had successfully eliminated race-based reporting from eGFR at their institution. And second, in early June, a paper came out in JAMA by Dr. Eneanya and colleagues that laid out the issue really clearly, and it got a lot of attention, so there seemed to be some more focused energy around this longstanding problem. So the 3 of us in family medicine who are here on the call got together, we were chatting, and realized why keep pushing for awareness when instead we can work for a structural change. So we reached out to Dr. Grubbs because we knew about her work in leadership, and thankfully she was interested in collaborating. We had an initial meeting, pulled together a letter laying out our issue and our demand to get rid of race-based reporting at our hospital for eGFR. And we had learned from speaking with the folks in Boston that the laboratory was an important player in their work. So to start out our process, we reached out to our lab. And just a few weeks later, we had an initial meeting with 2 people in the leadership there, sent them their letter, and thankfully they were on board. And they confirmed that they did have the power to make the change in their system once their director and a hospital committee approved it. Unfortunately, at that time, we were about to change over to a new medical record system, and they wanted to wait until that was implemented before moving forward. And we were like a little nervous that it was a stall tactic, but we didn't think so. And we followed up with them, and about 10 weeks later, we reached back out via email. Interestingly, we didn't initially hear back, but then a couple of weeks later, we opened up our health record, and there it was. We had a new reporting system, and the 2 values I mentioned earlier had been replaced by if high or if low muscle mass. So we were really glad that this had happened, and we had actually figured there were still additional hoops to jump through when we sent that follow-up email. So it was really great that we were able to have the change implemented so that the race-based reporting would stop doing harm to our patients. So we wanted to make sure that we built on the momentum and consolidated and did more education in our community to make sure that people understood the importance of things staying this way. We had started to hear some murmurings of opposition. So we put together a memo that we sent out to different departments. And then we also created 2 op-eds that we were able to circulate. And we got a lot of feedback, mostly positive, and we were seeing how this structural change really helped create a material shift and helped a much larger audience pay attention to the problem of race-based reporting so that we could begin to collectively imagine and create anti-racist and pro-Black medicine at SFGH. So with that, I'll pass it off to Stephen.
Great, thank you so much, Juliana. And also I just wanted to give a tremendous thanks to the composers of this event and authors of the manuscript. I believe that this is really gonna serve as a guiding light for the road ahead. And I think it's an honor and privilege to be in this forum and really do the work that you guys have so powerfully enabled with this manuscript. So with regards to the EGFR, as you can imagine, in sort of what Juliana had mentioned, there was a little bit of opposition, maybe a lot of opposition, but it really, I think, sort of calls into question this sort of accepted truth about how African-American race is biological and monolithic. And so I think the most important and critical opposition was that there was this concern that is sort of widely held in the EGFR equations, which supposedly are rooted in evidence and correct for race. And it really was this idea that their opposition was rooted in evidence and our position was not. However, there's a tremendous amount of evidence produced in numerous fields, including epidemiology, anthropology, genomics, to name a few, which demonstrates that the concept of race is not biologically tenable. Moreover, the argument about the validity of evidence, which is founded on race, raises questions about how our sociopolitical beliefs corrupt the process of creating good science. So to be clear, there's absolutely nothing precise about the social construct of race. Therefore, any result that you use, which is based on it, will itself be inherently imprecise. The biological use of race in medicine will invariably set up subpopulations within the African-American race itself or any other race in question, such that specific genes, environmental exposures, and behavioral practices are sort of like clustered in common. However, none of these things are shared by all the people who self-identify as Black or African-American. So this opposition of our argument being unfounded and theirs being sort of rooted in evidence obviously was problematic. So the EGFR language that states if Black may benefit some people who identify as Black, but it may harm many others. Hypertension guidelines that recommend meds based on race may benefit some people that identify as Black or African-American, but it may harm others. This is the reality that is either unknowingly reproduced or deliberately ignored every time we use race-based medicine. However, when lives are on the line, this level of imprecision just really can't be overlooked. So we sort of pressed on sort of in this contentious state. I think that probably many of you know who do this work, that the activism that challenges the power that racism provides is not easily conceded. In the case of race-based medicine and EGFR specifically, it is the institutional and historical power of the white racial lens that persist in the academic construct and in medical science that provides that opposition. And in doing this work, you run into this wall like time and time again. Ultimately, our battle was fought at the highest level with institutional leadership and rejected on multiple accounts. Nevertheless, thankfully, the change that we achieved in removing race-based reporting from the EGFR through courage and perseverance and activism, it remains. So while imperfect, the EGFR range that was ultimately decided on, which does include muscle mass, allows providers to use their clinical discretion to interpret what is best for the patient in front of them within what is scientifically agreed upon and without using the decidedly unscientific construct of race. Ideally, we can move toward a better biological measure of EGFR, such as cystatin C, which Vanessa had mentioned, which excludes race entirely at this point, but this will take more buy-in from the medical community. Luckily, we have bright and brave young minds like Noor and Maddie and Bernie and Brindley that are leading the way. I think with that, I'll hand it over to Monica so she can sort of tell us about some of the exciting things that are already happening in our medical community.
Thanks so much, Stephen. So yeah, I'm happy to pick it up from there and kind of talk about the future directions and where we'd love to go from here. So we're obviously very proud of this advocacy, and we feel, it was absolutely our duty to eliminate race-based EGFR at our hospital. And because, to not challenge it would be a failure to our patients, a failure to our learners and trainees, and a failure to truly uphold health equity in our medical system. And so, given that though, for now, our hospital is still the only one, aside from one other hospital in the entire country, to have abolished race-based reporting of EGFR. So, I was super proud of how far we've come. We have a ton more work to do, but we're also very excited to do it. And so I'm happy to report that since this successful change was made, we've had many other institutions reach out to us, to help strategize making this change where they are. We've been in contact with activists at several other academic institutions, including University of Washington, among many others. And a most recent exciting discussion I just had a couple weeks ago, actually, was with new connections that we made with some allies at Kaiser San Francisco. And they have agreed to bring this issue up with their equity committee. So that's very promising. And just imagine what an impact that would make if like something as big as the entire Kaiser system were to make the change like this. Or it makes us think of other big labs like Quest and LabCorp, for instance. So, if anyone has connections there and is interested in collaborating, like hit us up. And I'll just say another related area of work that a lot of us work in is just general medical school and residency training programs. So, we're calling for really long overdue, deep discussions about many problematic concepts relating to race just being taught in our medical education curricula. And, as the amazing student authors were mentioning, we just see this all the time, whether it's in test prep questions or whether it's in like journal articles, even the way the mainstream media, like news reports about COVID health inequities, for instance, just the way that health inequities are discussed in medicine and public health is very problematic. It's done in a way that constructs a narrative that places the blame on communities of color for the inequities that we all know are actually a direct result of structurally racist policies. But this narrative is weaponized to blame and harm communities of color, and it's constantly perpetuated in medicine everywhere. So, one future direction we're hoping to go to is really raising this awareness at the level of big medical professional organizations and medical education systems, and really holding them accountable for when they serve to uphold and perpetuate racist rhetoric in their training, their programming, and their continuing medical education. So, one quick example of how we're trying to target that issue. So the three of us here who are family docs recently introduced a policy resolution to the California Academy of Family Physicians. And it was basically a call to officially reject race-based medicine in all of their CAFP materials, publications, and policies. And we also wrote a letter to the editor for the Academy's journal, basically advocating for the same thing after having read an article in their journal that was problematic in its use of race-based clinical guidelines related to hypertension, as others mentioned. And related to that, we've advocated for UCSF to agree to host a symposium fully dedicated to the discussion of race-based medicine. So that's exciting. I know that we will all continue to create platforms for many more symposiums and discussions as this movement grows. And, as it does grow, it's absolutely imperative that we center voices outside of the ivory tower and outside of medicine. Partnering with grassroots and community organizations will be absolutely key, and involving interdisciplinary activists from across different sectors like ethnic studies, critical race theory, structural competency, and so many more will be key as well. And that's what's exciting about this gathering here. And so to end, I'll just say that, you know, this is not just about EGFR. It never was. It's not just about one or two individually isolated problematic equations or guidelines that we have in medicine. Racism is a system, and it's a whole systems problem. And so, you know, our group, we went after EGFR in a very targeted, you know, small advocacy action because we thought that it was a really nicely defined, obtainable goal. And that if we could just get this small win, you know, it could be the tipping point for just accelerating and amplifying this whole movement that's been growing and building momentum for years now, with so many amazing people who are here gathered today that have been working on it. And I just am hoping that this is hopefully a small step in the right direction to further advance this much needed discussion of interrogating and dismantling other forms of structural racism that are so deeply rooted in our healthcare and medical system. And so on behalf of our group, you know, it's just the biggest privilege to be united with others here dedicated to creating this future together of what truly anti-racist medicine can look like. So thank you all for this.
I'm just going to jump in, and I understand some questions have come up about why it matters, why this race correction matters in terms of patient care. So as I mentioned earlier, the race correction is roughly 20%, says that Black people have 20% higher filtering than a white person who has the same creatinine blood test. So that matters primarily in two areas. One, when we refer to nephrology care, to specialty care, and when we can refer to transplant evaluation. So, and let me make this a little more clear. You can get on the kidney transplant wait list when your GFR is 20. If Black, that number is roughly 24. That might not seem like a huge difference, but the difference can be years to take someone to go from 24 down to 20. And years is a really critical aspect of what goes into deciding who gets a kidney and when. So, and then in terms of when people get referred for specialty care, you all may be familiar with the fact that Black people in this country develop end-stage kidney disease at 3.5 times more than white people. So if people are being referred to specialty care later because, you know, we make this assumption that Black people's kidneys are working better than they really are, then that means this group that is disproportionately affected by kidney failure gets into specialty care later.
Awesome. Thank you so much to all of you. I also am going to use this moment to plug the paper that Dr. Grubbs just published that talks about this in even more detail. I don't know the title off the top of my head, but it's also about GFR and talks about both how this came about and the consequences for care. So I really encourage that. And it's just been so powerful to hear about your ability to not only talk about why this work matters, but also literally change systems. And next, it's my great honor to introduce you to our next panel. So the first speaker, or I'll say all the speakers. One is Osagie Obasogie, who is the Haas Distinguished Chair and Professor of Bioethics at UC Berkeley. And he's also a professor in the Joint Medical Program, aka one of my professors, and his scholarly interests include constitutional law, bioethics, sociology of law, and reproductive and genetic technologies. And from personal experience, I just wish every medical student could take a class with him. Angela Zhang is a fourth-year medical student at Brown in Providence, and a snippet of her anti-racism work has included participating and facilitating fellowships, as well as audio journalism, including her podcast, Not Built for Us. Dr. Jennifer Tsai is an emergency medicine physician and writer interested in health justice, education, and trauma-informed care. Her essays on race, gender, and inequity in medicine have appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, Scientific American, That News, and more. And Edwin Lindo learned the power of community organizing and fighting for justice in the Mission District of San Francisco, where he was born, where he grew up. And Edwin was a member of the Frisco 5 hunger strike. And he is now faculty of the University of Washington School of Medicine, Department of Family Medicine, where his research, scholarship, and teaching has, amongst other things, really focused on the creation of critical race theory in medicine, or hashtag MedCrit. Next, I'm going to pass the mic over back to Maddie to ask this panel some questions.
Great. So we are all just incredibly humbled to be digitally hanging out with y'all and learning with you. So first, we just wanted to hear quickly from all of you, where does the sort of topics that we're discussing in this report that the folks at SF General have been talking about, where does this come up in your work specifically? And maybe because it's Zoom and logistics are tricky, I can just pass it straight to Angela.
Hi, thanks. So thank you for having me. This is really, really exciting. I feel it's super inspiring to hear all of this work. So like Nora said, I'm a 4th year med student at Warren Alpert Medical School at Brown University. And I took this year between 3rd and 4th year to do a paid student position with our Office of Diversity Multicultural Affairs. I'm the ODMA fellow. And I think I thought of a couple of things when you asked this question. The first is that I help facilitate a year-long fellowship based on anti-racism and health equity that's open to medical students, residents, fellows, and faculty, as well as allied health professionals. This program was started by Ria Garcia Sampson, and the next year was facilitated by Radhika Rajan, who both are on this, who are watching this today, and facilitated next year by Giselle Bayo. So this is, it's really interesting to hear the first hour of this, because we really try to teach our fellows that as well. We created this when we found out that there was a disconnect between the medical school and the hospitals. And so in this way, we're able to teach the foundations and definitions of structural racism, as well as a lot of the critical methodology that we've talked about in terms of analyzing where these algorithms are coming from. We have topics like disability and whiteness and anti-racism, as well as teaching our fellows how to facilitate their own discussions in their clinical departments. And so in that way, I think I really loved doing that work. And a lot of that is also thanks to, you mentioned Lundy Braun a lot, and she is at Brown, and this work is truly impossible without her. She was one of the first to give a lecture on PFTs at the med school, and I think really spurred a lot of this work.
I think Osagi, you could be up next, if that works for you.
Sure. So thanks, Maddie. So, you know, my work over the past several years has really been steeped in critical race theory. However, my original training is in law and as a social scientist. So critical race theory itself came out of the field of law in the 80s and 90s as a way to understand the centrality of race and racism to how law is organized. So a lot of my initial work was really trying to expand that conversation in law. And when I was doing my PhD here at Berkeley, I realized that there are important conversations about a similar dynamic with regards to medicine. That is that once we understand that medicine itself as another professional field is organized in ways where race and racism have been central to its development over hundreds of years, then it allows for different possibilities for thinking about how medicine impacts people's lives. So that's how I started this rather interesting career path towards thinking about the relationship between critical race theory and medicine. And to be clear, people have been talking about the role of race and racism in medicine for a very long time. I think what critical race theory offers is a theoretical standpoint to really think in a systematic way how race and racism constitute the field itself. That is, it's central to how the field thinks about almost every aspect of the work that it does. And being able to tease that out in both a theoretical way and connecting it to the research and the clinical interactions provides a much more robust way of thinking about how race and racism pervade every aspect of the healthcare endeavor. So for me, it's been really interesting and important to transition that conversation from law into medicine and public health. And one of the most important things for me in making that transition was being able to bring that conversation to the classroom. So I can't tell you how excited and proud I am to see, my former students not only put together this amazing report, but also lead this conversation where we have, so many people joining us from around the country to talk about how critical race theory can shape how we think about and approach medicine. It's really, I think, wonderful, and I guess a wonderful statement about the power and the role of the joint medical program in terms of creating a space for you as medical students to simultaneously receive your medical training and have space to have these broader conversations in an interdisciplinary context to really understand how these broader conversations around race and racism and critical race theory can shape your medical education. The joint medical program is probably, one of the very few spaces where medical students can do this, where the time is cut out for that. And I think one of the goals we should have is how do we make space for this for almost every medical student to do this across the country? Because, for me, it's important to really kind of situate critical race theory as a way to produce better practitioners. That is, people who are sensitive to the multiple ways and intersecting ways in which race and racism shapes health outcomes, clinical outcomes, and how to kind of rethink the practice of medicine in a way that is more equitable and just. And I'm glad to see that the four of you are kind of at the forefront of this at an early part of your career. And I am sure that this brief and this conversation that we're having now will be a critical and important part in expanding this conversation to other people. So thank you.
Thank you, Asagi. Jenny, how do you see this coming up in your work? Jenny, I think you're on mute, unfortunately.
Yeah, I am. Can you hear me now? Thanks so much. I was, just saying thank you to everybody who is here, who's giving us your attention and time and all the time and effort and labor that has gone to work like this for years and years and years. Again, I think it's been mentioned several times, but this really comes from a legacy of scholars and activists fighting so that we can talk about it today, so that we can access this kind of knowledge today. And it's been really wonderful to connect with everyone and see this report come together. I totally echo some of the things that have been said before. I think the way and the site of justice that I am really interested in working on in all this is education. And I think that's proved to me in a lot of ways. One, there are a lot of people on this panel who are tuning in, who are interested in these ideas, who have background in ethnic studies, Africana studies, critical race theory. And that to me kind of shows the overwhelming power of how important education is and how important it is to be exposed to certain perspectives and what happens when we have really amazing teachers. And how do we get better teachers? How do we get more diverse teachers in medical school, medical training, I think is really part of the answer. Angela mentioned the ODMA fellowship on equity at Brown University that has done really incredible work. She mentioned Ree Garcia-Sampson and Radhika Rajan, who I love dearly. And that fellowship came out of student organizing. And this work that you're showing us tonight is incredible, this 70-page work, and not that it's only the 70-page work, but again, I think what we're getting at is we need to give students and activists space to think and work in these areas. And so part of the reason why we fought so hard for this fellowship as student activists is that it's a paid one-year position. It allows for kind of instituting sustainable work across years and longitudinally, and it also compensates the labor of students who are doing this work and are taking time out of their studies, out of their training to really make sure that this conversation continues to happen among faculty members and administration when it might otherwise not. I think otherwise, an exciting part of this year as a first-year resident is thinking much more about how to apply these problematic issues of biologic essentialism and working against it in the clinical medical sphere. And it's so inspiring and wonderful to have this room shared by practicing clinicians. I think, again, a lot of this literature has been taught to us and mentioned by professors and teachers in the social sciences or science and technology studies, but having that mentorship always meant that there was this certain gap of what does it mean to then practice medicine when so much of our knowledge, diagnostic tools, treatment algorithms are already built on racialized medicine, and we don't have the clinical experience necessarily to argue against it with with the amount of authority and confidence we want to. So again, thank you for the clinicians who are on here and helping us think through that. I think that'll be a major part is being able to replace, as Bernie mentioned, deconstruct and reconstruct the kind of race-based medicine practice guidelines that we know, and how do we push to be able to subvert that by replacing it with our own kinds of knowledge and scholarship.
Hey everyone, just want to first just thank you from the bottom of my heart. This work is truly unbelievable. Bernie, Noor, Maddie, this does lay the foundation, I think as mentioned before, for a scaffolding of incredibly critical thought and radical thought, which is, as Dr. Obasogie mentioned, was the foundation of critical race theory. Right, and why I consider myself a critical race scholar, but a critical race scholar that got his PhD in the streets. I mean, I can't thank enough the folks that I organize with and have taught me what it meant to create the praxis of the theory and see how it manifests in the streets and how systemic and foundational change occurs when people have decided that we are no longer going to take the injustices that we've seen for generations. And to now see that manifest in medicine, to see that manifest in medical education is a powerful move in the right direction. And I want to quote Dr. Bell, Professor Bell, who's one of the founders of critical race theory. And in one of his lectures, he quotes Professor John Calmore. And in it, he says, "I see critical race theory to be the tool that revolutionizes the culture, but it only starts by a radical assessment of that culture." And I think that's what critical race theory does. I think what the work we're doing here is that we are bringing a critical assessment of the culture and conditions that we're operating in the material world. And so what does that work look like for me? Like I said, I have, if Professor Osagie has a path that you mentioned was a little whirlwind, mine has been a complete roller coaster. From being legally trained to now sitting as faculty within the Department of Family Medicine, Associate Director for Faculty Development, having discussions both with medical students. As an educator, I started a course at UW School of Medicine called Critical Race Theory in Medicine, where we dig into a lot of these issues beyond just the clinic. Just yesterday, we had our class where we talked about settler colonialism and imperialism and the effect that has in the outcomes of the patients that we see in our clinics, where I go and sit in front of faculty who are clinicians and lab scientists, and their question is, they've always told us that race is biological, how is it not? And to have something like the report you all provide and the scholarship that has come before gives us the tools and the language to articulate why we need to move away from that. But where I also see it is when we, and I encourage not only us and those watching, but the medical students and our colleagues to find the connection between what we do inside the four walls of the medical school and the clinics, because if we silo ourselves, then it's only going to happen there. And the truth is we have to build the community outside of our hospitals and our medical institutions, because then in that solidarity, in that organizing, we start to see a magnificent form of transformation. One that I think is possible, though not incredibly easy. And so to tie this up, I think what we need to do is we need to identify, and we'll just discuss this more, is where do we create the space like this in perpetuity where there is a constant criticality of medicine and medical education and biomedical research to the point where folks can't run from it, and that it has to be a mandate of their medical teaching and medical education. And when we do that, we're gonna have scholars like you all graduating, going into the clinic, and not just saying, oh, let me give you this respirator, or sorry, let me give you this prescription for your asthma, and I'm gonna send you back into East Oakland. And I have no understanding that East Oakland, by racist policies and redlining, has the highest rates of respiratory disease, because 580 doesn't allow big rigs to drive through, and that's in the hills. The Oakland Hills and Piedmont. But 880 on the other side of the city allows all the 16-wheelers to drive through, dropping particulates into the backyards of our aunties and uncles and our little nephews and nieces, picking up that dirt, playing with it, and getting the highest rates of asthma. And we're wondering now why we're seeing our Black and brown folks dying at the hands of COVID-19 is because the racist politics of our country intended this to happen. But when we don't think of the history and its connection to our contemporary practices, then we just put our hands up and say, oh, then it just must be you, because there's something wrong with you. And as you all discussed in the report, this country has created the abnormality of Black and brown bodies, and it's now time that we reclaim it and say the only thing abnormal about this system is that it's inherently racist and inherently oppressive.
Wow, thank you all for that. That was just incredibly powerful. I want to just ask one question, and then I will hand it over for more of a Q&A that we've gathered from the questions from the Facebook chat and from some of the RSVPs. But I think something that Edwin started to touch on and that a lot of us have come into with this question of, okay, we know for sure, we've done our 70 pages worth of research to show that biological race is a false concept and we need to get rid of it. And that racism plays a huge role in how our society functions and how people are healthy or not healthy. So how can we go about abolishing biological race without negating the effects of racism? In other words, how are we putting into practice this idea that we should be doing anti-racist medicine and not colorblind medicine? And I also want to acknowledge that I've seen a lot in the Facebook chat that we say medicine a lot, and it's because we are medical students, but we know that this is applicable to all kinds of healthcare professionals and all different kinds of healthcare professional education settings as well. So anyone who wants to respond to that, how can we implement our anti-racist medicine, not colorblind medicine?
I think this gets back to a lot of what people have been talking about education. I mean, critical race theory and the social sciences have been talking about the use of race in a nuanced and critical way for a long time, and never have they recommended that you remove it or take race out of the system altogether and throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think the issue is that, as people have said, medical students, physician trainees, and people in the sciences, people elsewhere, need to have an education so that they can grasp the complicated concepts around race, political formation of race, racial politics, racial inequity, in order to know how to utilize race as a variable in a conscious and ethical way, without just saying the best thing that we can do is remove it if you're going to say that it has these problems. The point is to figure out the problems so we can use it well, and not say, do we use it or do we not? And I think critical race theory, again, one of its major tenets is about the sort of falsity of proclaiming colorblindness as a virtue or as a goal, and how that really erases the kind of inequity that happens along racial lines.
I really love this question because I think that when you leave a void and you leave a vacuum and you don't provide an alternate explanation, people will fill it in with things that they've learned, with their own values and with their own beliefs. And so to me, it's really what do you fill that vacuum and how do you fill it with? The first thing I think of is collaboration. So I talked about BASC and how it's kind of a hierarchy flattening fellowship among all levels. And that way it really helps, I think, as a learner, I've observed that the clinical environment feels different now to me as a fourth year than it did when I was first entering the hospital. And that's because this is our third cohort of BASC. This is the third year it's happened. There's about to be a critical mass of people. The other collaboration, other than just within medicine, of course, is across different fields. And so in my podcast, I'm really interested in amplifying voices that are historically, and unreasonably disrespected by medicine. And so I worked on an episode about the step one, the board exam and pattern and racial pattern recognitions that students learn. And my second episode is about redlining and shade inequity and the effects on health. And so for that, I'm really drawing in both folks in the community that are living there that are actually affected by this and their values and their needs, as well as academics in urban design, policy, urban history, architecture, people that really deal with space. And I think we don't think about those enough. The second thing I think is that it really starts from day one. It starts before day one of med school. It really starts before people are, 18 or even go to college, but being in med school is kind of the most we can do right now. So thinking about teaching structural determinants of health, I think specifically about, in 2019, Brown adopted from agitation from the Student Senate and students that have done this work for years, they adopted anti-racism as a value. And so how do we hold that? How do we hold them accountable? And Rob Williams, a student at Brown, actually proposed this amazing proposal that tied together all of the different efforts, as well as efforts at the undergrad campus in non-medicine disciplines, and proposed that the school adopt structural competency as a core ability. So this would hold the same weight as clinical reasoning, hold the same weight as scientific deduction. It's in the infancy right now, but the administration has been very supportive, and I'm really excited to see where that goes. And then the final thing that I have really noticed a lot is that medicine, I think, likes to think that we operate on certainty, but I actually feel like we like uncertainty, we can cover our butts, right? Like the number of times that I've seen, like for instance, when COVID first started happening, JAMA came out with this article that said, in China, we noticed that Asian males, so, let's disregard that, Asia is over 40 different ethnicities and is Asia only because of colonization and geopolitics, that Asian males may have more ACE2 receptors in their lungs and thus may be more susceptible to COVID than Asian women. And they said this is due to like unconfirmed data. And then they said, but also Asian men smoke more. So it could also be due to that. And it was like, well, you could have just stopped there, but you had to do this thing of like, we were smart and we thought about, maybe genetics is involved. We don't know. And I think that's what gets perpetuated. And that's what, Nora, you talked about up to date, kind of perpetuating these half non-truths that are passed down decades and centuries. And I think that's what really comes from. And we're really afraid to admit that we don't know, or afraid to be really conclusive, for fear that someone else, will call us out on it or something. And so I really would love to see a fundamental change in medicine where we are not afraid to say, this is not genetic because of this, or just, not mention it or something like that.
I'll add one last point as far as the color blindness is we have a lot of our colleagues, particularly white colleagues, who will tell us, but Edwin, I treat everyone equally. Right? Like, are you asking me to do something different? Or because if you do, then you're telling me you want me to provide treatment based on someone's race. You just told me that that's biologically relevant. And I say, I see what you're doing here. You're trying to be tricky. Because the truth is, yes, we're asking you to provide the care that is based on the deficiency of the racism that has existed, that has caused a disproportionate harm throughout time. And so there is a huge gap of standard of care of what you should be providing, but you haven't been providing it. And so that gap is what I'm asking you to change. That's the difference. I am asking you to treat Black patients better. I am asking you to treat Black patients and give them a colorectal screening more often, or at least ask them more often. I'm actually asking you, yes, to ask the parents if they've experienced racism or if their children have experienced racism, because it has a direct effect on the emotional and psychological health and well-being of these patients. Are you going to ask that of a white patient? Most likely not. So yes, I want you to treat different, but that's to get to a point of equity and justice, not treat different because you think their liver functions different than a white person. That's the difference between colorblindness and health justice, and actually providing justice to our patients and our communities.
Thank you all. This has been absolutely amazing, and I want to make sure that we have some time to address some of the questions that have been coming through the Facebook chat and some of the RSVP links. So it is my absolute pleasure, and I'm super excited to introduce my classmate and friend, Aminta Kuyete, who is a proud Bay native, and she is going to lead our Q&A. A little bit about Aminta. She was born and raised in Oakland. She is a student at the UC Berkeley-UCSF Joint Medical Program with us. Her research is focused on building an anti-racist medical education curriculum for healthcare providers. And my favorite line in her bio is that she is also a reader, a writer, a kitchen magic maker, and a deep believer in laughter and joy. So, Aminta, what questions do people have for us?
Thank you, Maddie, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you again for this panel. This has been wonderful. You've addressed so many of the comments already. And so pulling from the chat, I'm going to try to synthesize some of the great questions that have come. So the first one is, there have been several questions in the comments around how to discuss the concept of basic sciences, such as genetics, without reproducing the notion that race has a biological foundation. Essentially, how do we ensure that we can address health disparities without looping back to the false notion of race as a rooted in biology? And that's open to the panel.
Professor Obosogi, we haven't heard from you. I'd love to hear from you.
Sure. So I think the most straightforward way to answer that question is that we have to understand that race reflects a social process, not a biological one. So race can be meaningful to the extent that it reflects the way that a society treats a certain population of individuals without necessarily buying into the idea that race reflects some type of inherent or natural difference. And so once we understand that race is a marker of social differentiation, that is that social groups have different access to resources and are treated differently by others, then we can understand that race can help us in a clinical context in terms of predicting the certain types of experiences that people might have regarding or with regards to how they present themselves in society. And we can do that without necessarily suggesting that that reflects some type of inherent difference or genetic difference that suggests that certain groups are, just inherently less worthy than others.
I'll jump in for a sec. One thing I've tried to do at University of Washington is explain to folks that we carry two identities, right? We carry a biological identity and we carry a social political identity. And when we try to describe this, I got to tell you, my physician colleagues act as though I'm talking about quantum physics. They're like, how are you telling me I have two identities? Well, the truth is that we maneuver the world in a social space, in a social political space. Race has been used to differentiate and to allocate resources in time immemorial. And that's been the tool of race and the structure and hierarchy of race. Historically in science, biomedical research in science, they have tried to scaffold and implant race as a biological identity, which it isn't. As we saw in the report, and you all did an amazing job, it's nowhere near that. And so if we can differentiate those two and say, I present to you my social political identity, which is the Central American indigenous, should have no play and involvement in you diagnosing how I'm going to survive COVID-19. Unfortunately, that separation has almost dissolved. And many of our colleagues say, oh, but Edwin is such a useful tool and proxy. They say, well, if it's such a good proxy, then why don't you just name the things that it's proxying for? Because those seem to be really good. And what happens is they struggle because race is standing on a house of cards if it were to be used as a biological identity. And the moment we critique it, that house falls. And so our job is to continue to be critical of it, because when it falls, we will get a much clearer picture of what our identities are in the biological realm and not in the social realm.
Yeah, Evan, I think that's a great point. I just want to pick up on a small thread that you introduced. So as someone whose work engages critical race theory and spans across law, medicine, public health, one of the responses I often get is that, well, you're making some good points, but it's really hard to incorporate that idea of race into the work that we do. And whenever I get that response, I just take a step back. And it's always amazing to me that, for example, you think about the remarkable work that folks are doing in medicine, or the folks that are doing it in surgery. So, people are transplanting hearts. Folks are saving lives through these heroic interventions and doing amazing things that are really complicated and require a remarkable amount of technical specification. We don't see those challenges as too hard. We step up and we innovate and we make sure they work, right? And so the things that we're talking about here in this panel are, relatively speaking, quite simple. They're easy, right? Don't be a jerk, right? Don't necessarily assume that the way that someone presents themselves in society speaks something or says something important about their predisposition towards some type of health outcome. Treat them as an individual as opposed to as a group predisposition. These are relatively straightforward ideas, and they're not that complicated, but they get treated as if that they're just too complex to incorporate into the clinical interaction. So this is to say that, this is part of the conversation where we have to really engage people and kind of break down why it's important and why there are alternative ways to conceptualize the role of race and racism as a way to not only produce better medicine and scientific research, but also to improve health outcomes for folks. And that if folks can engage in the complicated technical work that they do in their home fields, whether it's medicine, public health, genetics, law, whatever, then I think they can understand this makes a difference between social race and biological race.
Maybe I'm only supposed to talk about kidneys, but I just want to jump in here for a second and talk about like a real life example in my experience. Whenever you talk about removing race from things, people say, well, but what about sickle cell? And my response to that is, sickle cell is not a Black people's disease. It's like, why do we have to start from a racial lens when it's from a geographic etiology? It's not just Black people that get sickle cell disease. It's about where malaria was endemic. So this is the thing where people try to conflate genetics with race, and it's just wrong.
Right, and if I can just add one more thing, I think the tension that we're always running up against is that medicine sees itself as a neutral and pure endeavor to improve health outcomes, and we really have to face the fact that medicine has always, or I would say we have to face the fact that medicine has been a deeply political and ideological practice. And in order for us to get to the place where medicine can be truly neutral and can be something that serves the public regardless of their background, then we need these kind of critical theoretical interventions to disembed the problems that have been put into the field over many, many years, and so that we can achieve the goal that we want it to be. But it's only by taking these ideas seriously and confronting them head on that we can even approach this ideal of medicine that we all want to see.
And I'll do a final jump in. Dr. Sagi and Vanessa threw an alley-oop, and some people like to tell us, and our colleagues say, that medicine is apolitical. And I got to tell you right now that there is nothing apolitical about medicine. The politics of medicine are deeply rooted in the construction of this country. A handful of physicians signed the Constitution in this country, allowing slavery to exist, chattel slavery to come from West Africa to here. So if you think you're being apolitical, you've already made a political choice to have a blind eye to what actually is happening.
Yeah, really quick, I've told by the facilitator 1 minute. So what I was going to say is a lot of this has to do with following scientific ethics. And I think the hugely frustrating part of this is the cyclic kind of logic that scientists use when they say, we're going to assume that race is genetic. And so when we ask, is race genetic? Is there anything genetic about race? Obviously, they've already propped that self up. So it's actually really refreshing that geneticists are really good allies in this work in terms of race and medicine, whereas a lot of other scientific fields give a lot of pushback. Geneticists really understand what it means to be an ancestral cline, a geographically designated populational pool that has real association and technical links to things like evolution. And they understand that it makes no sense to consider a social construct or a continent as the same thing as that. So really it's about good science, it's about technicality. And going back to one of the things that people mentioned about how it seems really crazy, I just want to mention my first week of medical school, we learned you know, a biochemistry block, and I sat next to somebody who had a PhD in biochemistry and I had never taken biochemistry, and we took the same exam. So when people come up with these thoughts about, oh, it's too complicated, the sociology of medicine is too complicated for people, they come in at it from different sides. Well, we expect people to do that for other issues, and recognizing this as adamant and a necessary part of our training mandates the fact that they learn it anyway.
I want to build off of Jenny's point. I think a lot of criticism I hear towards this work when I mention it to people is they think that it's really antithetical and contrary to the whole field of genetics and all of epidemiology and public health. Obviously, that is not true. I think we can hold multiple realities and multiple ideas in our minds, and this is no different. I think that in the same way we can be synergistic with the humanities and social sciences, we should also be synergistic with genetics and public health. So, you know, like Jenny said, there are clients, and they're, you know, again, we only answer the questions that we ask. So Dorothy Roberts has an example in her book about how researchers grouped genetic clustering into 6 clusters that correspond roughly to our continents and our races. But what the researchers did not mention is that had they tried to group people into 20 clusters or 2 clusters, it would also have grouped. And there's a paper that I can link later that shows clustering in this different scope. So it's all about the scope that you see. And so you know, on a graph, it clusters according to the 6 continents. But if you zoom in to a country like Kenya, and you look at all the different tribes that have historically lived in separate places, there's also just as much variability. And so looking at that scope is super important. And in this way, I think listening to geneticists is actually extremely valuable. They have so much nuance that I think medicine scrapes the top off and says, and, you know, we'll just run with that. But without all of that depth of training that they get, it's really almost impossible to understand the way that genetics and biology and this really complex term of like ancestry and race do interplay.
I wanted to take a second just to make a comment on the slippery slope of genetics. I think that as Ginny was saying, that genetics is a geneticist, and genetics is sort of a sister science and can be used as an important ally in this work. But I think that we have to be careful and wary of the slippery slopes that is genetics. The way that medicine is such that there's a temptation to latch on to genetics and sort of precision medicine as sort of the answer, the solution to the problem of racism in medicine. And so one can see a future where we can sort of move into genetics as another form of colorblind medicine, right? Where we don't think of race anymore. We sort of extract race out of the picture and just look for the gene, look for the SNP, look for the polymorphism, but we don't consider race as, and its import as a determinant of certain outcomes. So I think that genetics is an important avenue, an important space to sort of complicate this notion of race-based medicine and use it to serve us. But I also think that we have to be very mindful of sort of how it can be used to also sort of challenge our attention as it's paid to racism and its importance in creating disparities.
Thank you so much for everyone in the comments, for everyone in this panel, and all of our experts here who have really brought such energy and such passion and such spirit into this conversation. And again, this is why it is so important to have an interdisciplinary conversation about these issues. So again, we thank all of you for joining us. This is what makes this work so powerful. And now we're about to transition to unveiling the Institute for Healing and Justice in Medicine. And we know that the second question that was going to be asked was about community. And this is actually where it all starts. And so I just want to start off with really acknowledging that when we were writing our inaugural report, the research and the writing processes were often emotional and oftentimes lonely. And we wanted to understand why our medical and graduate studies oftentimes had us feeling like we and our families and our communities of intersectional identities were seen as less than whole. And so we searched for inspiration and motivation during our process, and we met amazing activists and students along the way who reminded us that we're not alone in doing this work. And our deepest inspirations have actually been people outside of medicine, community activists, critical race theory scholars, almost all of them are here present on this call today, ethnic studies pioneers, holistic healers, writers, therapists. And we also realized that we were not the only medical students who actually felt this way. And the reality is that medical education and the Western medical system has deliberately silenced many learners and communities, especially Black, Brown, Indigenous, students of color, and those of intersectional identities for ages. And so after a series of conversations, oftentimes with laughter, with crying, with existential crises and questions, me, Nora, Maddie, we decided to create the Institute for Healing and Justice in Medicine. And we aim to be a community, a research epicenter, and a dialogue space centered on publishing and uplifting social justice and community activism in Western medicine and public health.
So we just wanted to go ahead and make sure that you all got the chance to see all the faces of the rest of our founding team. Most of them were speaking today, but for those who weren't, this is just an amazing and like vibrant group of interdisciplinary folks from around the nation. Their longer bios are on the website. Fully recommend you go check them out. And I'm just so grateful to be sharing space with all these folks. And I'm gonna pass the mic back to a few other folks to read our vision for the Institute.
So the next 3 slides are vision and mission, and me, Aminta and Trey will read it. When Bernie, Maddie, and Nor read this to me, I literally got chills, and part of the reason was they asked us to close our eyes. So if you are watching and you feel comfortable, please just take a deep breath in a second and close your eyes for the next 3 slides. So our vision. We envision and work towards a world where collective healing and justice are at the center of health and well-being. We uplift, share, and produce knowledge and healing practices that affirm the inherent wholeness and humanity of each person, especially those that have faced violence and/or have been deliberately silenced by medical institutions. We critique, interrogate, and dismantle hegemonic frameworks in Western medicine, public health, and epidemiology that currently frame Black, Brown, Indigenous, queer, gender diverse, disabled, and communities of intersectional identities as inherently diseased, broken, and in a perpetual state of health disparity.
The Institute for Healing and Justice in Medicine is a refuge grounded in critical race theory, Black liberation studies, third world and transnational feminism, community organizing, ethnic studies, somatics, decolonization studies, healing justice, and ancestral healing. We follow the tradition of countless women of color scholar activists who embrace that the way we move through the world, our personal and professional lives are inherently political, a theory in the flesh. By centering and integrating these perspectives with the strengths of Western medicine, we are building a new legacy and epistemology built on the work of generations and ancestors before us. We work towards a new medicine where all forms of injustice are acknowledged, addressed, and dismantled in all their forms. We work towards a world where each person is able to be healed, cared for, and loved.
Our mission. Guided by the values of healing, community, and justice, the Institute for Healing and Justice in Medicine is an interdisciplinary hub, a community, a research epicenter, and a dialogue space. We center around publishing and uplifting perspectives, narratives, experiences, research, and other works related to healing, social justice, and community activism in Western medicine and public health. We foster space for vibrant dialogue and debate, consciousness raising, and movement building, seeking to sharpen our collective analysis and develop methods to critique structures of power in medicine through community scholarship and solidarity.
And so now I'll be sharing about what our key activities are envisioned for the Institute. And I did want to respond to something from the comments that was about how people can gather institutional and community support. So first of all, we're hoping that some of these activities can do that. And I also wanted to share that for us, that we are so grateful for all the support we have now. And also, as Bernie kind of alluded to, though, when we started writing this report, that support like wasn't really there. And I want to highlight this meeting that we did have with one professor, Tina Sachs, who really told us, we had received several comments to like make our tone different and to lighten our tone. And Tina Sachs told us to be bold, to be true to our voices, because we really had done the work and the research. And that was truly so empowering for us to move forward. And so I want to throw that back to everyone who was asking how they can get support too, is just really stay true to your voice. Go ahead, write that op-ed, say that comment to that professor, cite our report while you do it if you want to, make the tool, etc. And hopefully these key activities of our institute can also help you do that if you want to get involved. And so the first one is we envision hosting working groups and that are created to solve issues related to healing, community, and justice in Western medicine. And we aim as an institute to assist and mentor these working groups to produce things like briefs or apps or tools. And then as for the peer-reviewed publication, that aims to serve as a platform for narratives, voices, and experiences related to the intersection of social justice, health justice, and community activism. For the Justice Library and Repository, we aim to bridge, share, and amplify all existing work and activism related to social justice and community activism in medicine and public health. And this includes activism both by the community as well as members and students, including, this includes syllabi, op-eds, theses, podcasts, more and more. And in addition to hosting a repository, we hope to host gatherings with leaders in these in this work to facilitate more conversations and community. Today was just the beginning. And finally, we also, inspired by the Freedom School, want to host healing gatherings for all involved in the Institute, as well as a healing and medicine speaker series focused on grounding practices like self-care, finding community, and more. And read about all this more about all of this on our website.
So I just want to acknowledge that we can feel y'all's energy. We can feel all of the energy on Facebook, even though we can't see y'all. We definitely know that that there are so many people out there across the US, across the world, who are doing this work, and we want to be that bridge that facilitates and connects all of us together, because as a force, we are unstoppable. So again, we just want to thank you so much for spending your evening with us, for learning with us, for collectively imagining and working towards a new medicine centered on healing, justice, and community. And we are just so grateful that you have joined us, and we want to make sure that you know that we're going to send up a follow-up regarding all of the questions that y'all have had on the chat that we didn't get to answer, and opportunities to be involved in the Institute, because we're a hella fun team, y'all. So again, we are just so grateful. Stay safe and in love, especially during this time. We promise to be in touch, and may we all go forth and be great. Thank you. Have a great evening.